In the beginning, in the very, very beginning, there was nothing but the dark, formless waters of none, and she was the first goddess. When she existed before anything else existed, she filled everything, but she was all alone. Though she contained everything that would ever come to be, she was alone and became lonely. Now, the moment that she became lonely, she became aware that she could create another out of herself, and with that thought, the first light sprung into being. The first thing came into being, and the first thing was the world mountain, Atum. And as they sat together, eternity after eternity, at length Atum brought forth Shu and Tefnut. They were the air and water. And as they danced their dance together, they brought forth Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Now when they were first created, they enfolded each other in their arms, and they lay together so tightly that nothing could come between them. They lay together so tightly that there was no room for creation, until Tefnut came and lifted up Nut, the sky goddess, until her great body was arched with only her toes and her fingertips touching the earth. There her body became the great dome of the sky, containing all the stars. Now there was room for creation. Now Geb and Nut had two sets of twins. The first were Isis and Osiris, and they were given the rule of the earth. The second were Set and Nephthys, and they were given the rule of the underworld. Isis and Osiris became the first king and queen of Egypt, and it is said that it was them who brought humanity all of the gifts of civilization. They taught them to till the earth and to bake bread. They taught them to pick fruit from the trees, to grow grapes and make wine. Time passed by in happiness and in abundance, but before very much time had passed, Set began to grow jealous. He sat in the underworld where all was cold and dark, and he looked out to where Isis and Osiris were adored by all of their people. He began to plot a way to bring Osiris down, to kill him and take rule of the earthly kingdom for himself. Now, Osiris would go abroad, go to look how things were faring all over the land of Egypt, and while he went, he would leave Isis behind in charge. Now, every time that Osiris returned, there would be a great feast, and Set decided that it would be at the next feast that he would unfold his plan. So it was. In the midst of the great merriment, when very much wine had been drunk and very much food had been eaten, Set pushed open the doors at the back of the great hall, and he clicked his fingers and summoned his servants to bring in the most beautiful sarcophagus, covered in lapis lazuli and gold and all sorts of jewels. It was brought in, and Set made a challenge. Everybody there in the hall looked upon it and fell in love with it. It was the most divinely beautiful thing they had ever seen, and they all wanted it. And Set said to them, I tell you that anybody here who fits inside this sarcophagus perfectly may have it for themselves. Now, who do you think Set had measured before he had pulled this trick? Before Set had built the sarcophagus, he had made sure he knew exactly what size Osiris was. So one by one they lay down in the sarcophagus, and of course when it came to Osiris's turn, he fitted perfectly. Not a hair's breadth that his toes or his head was left over. Great laughter and applause broke out, but in the very same moment that it did, the doors at the back of the hall burst open once more, and in rushed 72 co-conspirators to Set, who nailed the coffin shut, sealed it with molten lead, and took it away to the sea, where it was cast in. Now Osiris floated down the river, and Isis lost, bereft, cut off her hair, put on mourning clothes and began to search. She searched and searched, but to no avail, because the casket had floated all the way to the coast of Syria, where it had landed on the shore, and a great tamarisk tree had grown up around its trunk. It wasn't just any old tamarisk tree. Because Osiris's body lay in the centre of it, it grew divinely fragranced. So much so that it became famous far and wide, and before very long the king and queen of that place came to see the tree themselves. Astarte, the queen, fell in love with the fragrance and the look of the trunk, and she ordered that it be cut down and brought to their palace and used as a pillar in the centre of the room where her own little son would be nursed. So it was, brought there, with Osiris still in the centre of it. Now Isis was still searching, and when she came to the shores of Syria, she took herself to the one place that she knew she would get all the news. She took herself to the well, where everybody came to collect water, just near the palace. Every day the handmaidens of Astarte would come, and Isis, dressed as an old woman, would braid their hair. And when their hair was braided, she would breathe her sweet fragrance. Astarte thought that not only was the fragrance of the pillar in the middle of the room divine, but the fragrance of these braids was divine, and so she sent for that old woman. And so Isis was brought to the room where the pillar stood, and she could feel Osiris inside it. She was given the job of nursemaid to the little boy, and every night she would place him in the fire, because she wanted to give that little boy the finest gift that any human could receive, the gift of immortality. She would put him in the fire to burn away the mortal part of him. And while he was there, she would become a swallow and fly around and around that pillar, mourning and shedding tears. That was until one night. Astarte came in the middle of the night to see her baby son and opened the door. There she saw him in the fire, and she let out such a cry that the spell was broken. The boy was denied the priceless boon that Isis wished to give him, and Isis had to admit who she was and why she had come there. Astarte agreed that the pillar must be cut open, and the body in the casket must be given back to Isis. So it was that they found themselves sailing back across the sea to Egypt, and Isis hid the casket in the marshes. And she would come every night to look upon her beloved husband's body, until one night at full moon, Set himself was walking in the marshes and came upon the casket. He pulled off the lid, and he yanked out the body, and he cut it into 14 pieces, which he scattered as far and wide as he could. That night, when Isis came once again, she was grief-stricken, and she had to go and search. She brought with her her sister, Nephthys. Isis, Nephthys, and 2 children. The first was a child by the name of Horus, who wore the head of a hawk. And he was the child of Isis and Osiris, who was conceived as she flew around the pillar in that room night after night. The second was Anubis, who wore the head of a jackal. And he had been conceived when Osiris mistook Nephthys for his own wife one night in the dark marshes. All 4 of them searched far and wide until they'd found the pieces, and when they found them, they wrapped everything in bandages, all back together as perfectly as they could, and for the first time, the funerary rites were performed that were made over the body of every pharaoh of Egypt from that day forth. Osiris was returned to life, and he walked among the living again. But he could no longer rule the earth. He was sent down to be the ruler of the underworld, for Set had been cast out. There he sits to this day, and it is said that each of us, when we die, will go down to stand before Osiris, and he will listen to the story of our lives, after which he will hold out his scales, and our hearts will be placed on them, and on the other side the feather of truth. He will watch the scales and pronounce judgment of what will happen to us, or so they say.